Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I'm a PhD in neuroscience at the University of Pennsylvania, and I had plans to discuss microdosing today. But a story was recently released by a group that monitors environmental toxins that pretty much completely demanded my attention. And I suspect others might be interested in hearing about it as well. So I figured we might discuss that instead today, and we can talk about microdosing in the not too distant future. So the reason that it kind of demanded my attention is largely due to the fact that I have a daughter that's about a year and a month old now. And ever since my wife became pregnant, I started thinking about all the things in our day-to-day lives that might introduce various contaminants that might not be particularly ideal to the health, or might not be particularly threatening to the health of adults our age, but might compromise fetal development or, the development of infants and young children as she gets older. And so, I did things like replace all of our plastic Tupperware food storage with glass alternatives. I replaced all of our plastic water bottles with glass water bottles. I got a few air purifiers for the apartment, given the research showing that exposure to airborne pollutants is associated with increased likelihood of various developmental effects. We live in Philadelphia after all, and essentially all large cities have to confront, airborne pollution. So, however, in Philadelphia, for all the public health challenges that my favorite city in the country faces, Philly has a fairly good reputation for its tap water. Good enough, in fact, that there's this sort of campaign to educate the residents of Philadelphia that they ought to opt for drinking tap water instead of bottled water, because the regulations of the quality of bottled water don't ensure higher purity nor quality. So, in fact, regulations of bottled water are sort of surprisingly light. And I say light because, one might expect that there might be some kind of higher standard applied to bottled water to justify the sale of water as a commodity in a country where it's essentially free to drink water. Higher standards than, for example, city tap water. Well, these are the regulations that are applied to bottled water. So the water has to come from an approved source, and this doesn't mean that the FDA is evaluating the purity of those sources for every bottle, of course, but it has to come from some protected natural source like a spring or a well that's been assessed to ensure, limited contamination. Also, the bottled water can only be labeled in certain ways. So they can't just straight up say the water is from somewhere it's not, right? They can't take the water from the Philly tap and say it's from the pristine waters of Puerto Williams in Chile, which, by the way, is identified as having unusually pure water by a group at the University of North Texas, University of Magallanes, I believe, and the Institute of Ecology and Biodiversity at the University of Chile. So, they can't lie about where the water's from. The FDA regulations, and by the FDA I mean the Food and Drug Administration here in the United States, they identify maximum levels of things like organic contaminants, which include things like bacteria and viruses and parasites, as well as inorganic contaminants like radon or lead or arsenic, things you don't particularly want to be drinking. And so one of the main reasons that the FDA doesn't apply unique regulations to bottled water is because it must be derived from a water source that they're already regulating. So in other words, even if I started a bottled water company named Anthropoid's Magical Brilliance Potion or something, and just literally filled plastic water bottles with Philly tap water, the fact that Philly's required to test their own water would ensure that at least the standard applied to Philly city water would be applied to my Magical Brilliance Potion. So, it'd be incredibly unlikely that any arsenic or E. coli was introduced between Philly's tap and my Magical Brilliance Potion. And so, further, there just haven't been many examples or any examples of bottled water being contaminated. And so the contamination of bottled water is basically reflects what's seen in your normal tap water. So there just hasn't been a cause for increased concern. And in fact, there are some arguments to be made that city tap water has to meet higher standards than bottled water. For example, when tap water is unable to contain any E. coli or fecal coliform bacteria, which is exactly what it sounds like, bottled water can have trace levels of these bacteria. And so, while I'm thrilled that E. coli exists and I use it to produce viruses and presumably inhabits my gut, I wouldn't be thrilled to drink it in my water. And so there's this kind of third-party non-governmental organization that regulates the quality of bottled water called the International Bottled Water Association. And producers of bottled water have to meet the standards of this organization, which requires various purification practices for any water to be derived from city drinking water. And there are like various inspection schedules and so on that like render it likely a meaningful regulatory entity. But back to city water, they're tested many, many times per month to ensure that contaminants haven't reached any dangerous levels. Bottled water providers are not required to endure such like stringent testing schedules, right? So, and also different states have different standards for the quality of bottled water. And so I only bring up this comparison because many people I know sort of seem to like subconsciously assume that bottled water is safer than tap water. And I happen to know that they're completely unaware of the details of how the EPA and FDA regulate the qualities of municipal bottled waters, or municipal waters and bottled waters. But it's worth noting, before we dive into this news story, that there's no guarantee that bottled water is inherently healthier or at least less damaging than your tap water. Okay, so let's get to the story that I'm referencing here. So a new series of tests of water quality in dozens of cities in the United States have shown that the levels of a particular group of chemicals that are used to make various like industrial products appears to be higher than previously estimated by the EPA or the Environmental Protection Agency, as well as the organization conducting this new round of testing. And so in other words, like even this group that conducted this new round of testing underestimated the levels of this family of chemicals prior to this new evaluation of drinking water quality. And so the organization to which I'm referring is the Environmental Working Group, or EWG. And so they're a nonprofit group that focuses on research and advocacy, that focuses on like monitoring toxic chemicals, drinking water pollutants, agriculture, and like corporate accountability. And so like any source of information, they ought to be subject to skepticism, and more on that later. But this study in particular has several scientists and public health experts signing their name to its results. So the group performed tests on the tap water of 31 states and Washington, D.C., finding that only one location had no detectable levels of this family of chemicals, and only 2 others had levels below those that they cite. Independent studies indicate as hazardous to health. And so part of the reason that this news release demanded my attention was the fact that Philadelphia ranked among the highest major cities on the list. However, many metropolitan areas had notable levels of these chemicals. And so some of the highest, or some examples of the highest levels that they tested are in order: Brunswick County in North Carolina, Quad Cities in Iowa, Miami, Florida, Bergen County in New Jersey, Wilmington in North Carolina, and then Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, which is then followed by Louisville, New Orleans, Charleston, Decatur, and Washington, D.C. And so, they tested a bunch of other cities, right, in their series of tests. Oh, and here you can see, it might be a little bit small, but I'll have the link to the study down in the description. And so, the group notes that they only tested 30 chemicals within this family of chemicals, what are called PFAS or PFAS chemicals. Okay, so what are PFAS or PFAS chemicals? So it's a family of a huge number of various chemicals, and they're used to make like coatings, generally speaking, coatings on things like, containers, or also like clothing, furniture, adhesives, and maybe most famously non-stick coating items. So, you might encounter them in like fast food containers, or Teflon, or Scotch Guard, or like some cleaning products and some paints and sealants, and even that like white tape stuff that we use to seal the connections between our shower heads, to their water spouts. And they're also used in like flame retardant foams, right? Like, the stuff that like firefighters use to fight fires. And so PFAS is like the name of an entire family of chemicals that includes other initialisms like PFOA, PFOS. And so they've been used since like the 1950s, right? And the point is that they're used to produce a bunch of products that we either sit on or eat from, and as this study suggests, drink. So the study has generated a pretty big splash, no pun intended, because previous tests of water quality in many of the cities included in this evaluation revealed no detectable PFAS, which includes Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. But they note that their monitoring system only includes 6 compounds of this family of PFAS compounds. So, and some cities, including Philadelphia, state that their testing for PFAS in source water, quote, has not detected concentrations above EPA's advisory level. But they quote someone they call an expert at the Water and Environmental Technology Center at Temple University, also in Philadelphia, who said, quote, "If you sample it, you will find it." So they also state that they're only describing the results from a single sample from each of the water systems they tested, and that the cities they tested are sometimes served by like multiple sources of water, and they have a few other caveats. But like, in other words, they're saying that the results of these tests are just like an indication that the levels of these chemicals may be higher than we could have expected in city waters. Okay, so here's where I step back from the story and consider like what we know about this family of chemicals. So to give you an idea of what went through my mind when I saw this study, like given how products that molecules like PFOS are and so on in that family are used to make, like Teflon, for example, is probably the most famous. My expectation was that they would be unusually unreactive or like inert. And so in other words, from what I understand about like the material science and chemistry of these compounds is that they're basically like long carbon chains that are pretty much like preoccupied with a bunch of other little nubs, right? Like, and they're fluorine atoms. And because they're fluorine atoms, they're incredibly strongly bound to that carbon chain, right? And so you can see here those little gray balls, carbon. Those little neon green balls are fluorines. And those bonds that tie them together are extremely strong. And so, and because those bonds are so strong, other molecules, they're almost incapable of interacting with other molecules. And so those other molecules just sort of slip off of them, right? Whether they're the molecules present in like eggs and bacon or the various things from which like Scotchgard is used to protect against, right? And so, they're involved, right, in like, they're also used for like, fighting fires and clothing manufacturing and so on because of these properties. And so it's worth noting that there aren't like just 4 of these chemicals, right? There are hundreds that have been reported as being used to the EPA in the U.S., and that's likely just a small sample of what's actually, used or exists. And so, all of that to say that the fundamental concept behind these compounds is that they're unlikely to react with a bunch of molecules. So, if they're so unlikely to interact with other molecules in general, why would they be any more dangerous than other chemicals to which we're exposed, right? And so I'm currently unaware of any of the specific biochemistry that might explain those interactions, but there have been some studies that show correlations between exposure to them and negative health outcomes. So like one example is a review of studies that basically showed that there was like an association between childhood exposure to PFAS with conditions like dyslipidemia, renal function, or disruption of renal function, asthma, vaccine responses, and the age of onset of menstruation, or when girls get their first period. And so this article published in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health, it corroborates some of the findings by the National Toxicology Program Office of Health Assessment and Translation, a mouthful, which they quote as saying, quote, PFOA or PFOS is presumed to be an immune hazard to humans. However, they also highlight that longer term studies need to be performed where the studies can follow when people have been exposed to establish just how these chemicals affect our health. And so, to be clear, those studies would be incredibly difficult to perform, right? If I were to try and set out to perform these studies, it would be like a nightmare. I don't even know how a sample of people in the United States who've never been exposed to these chemicals could even be recruited. And then how a study could ethically evaluate the effects of the exposure to these chemicals, if you can imagine intentionally exposing people to these chemicals, we're just left to these sort of statistical assessments of we know this population has been exposed and we know that there's X, Y, or Z increased or decreased incidence of various diseases, right? So basically here's where I'm at, right? I'm going to keep hunting for studies that assesses the correlations between exposures to this family of chemicals and human development. And, I'm most concerned with that specific interaction because I have a baby daughter that's about a year old, and Philadelphia was identified as being among the cities with the highest concentration of this family of chemicals, and I live in Philadelphia, right? And so, that said, while I was neurotically replacing all the containers from which my wife consumed food and water, with glass, I also changed our source of drinking water to from the typical standard Brita filter to the Brita Long Last filter. And so, just to be totally clear, I'm not sponsored by Brita, nor am I even endorsing them. But just FYI, the Brita Long Last filter, which is basically just a big old version of the typical Brita pitcher filter, is certified according to the NSF standard that's rated to reduce the concentration of this family of chemicals. And so just in case like you're interested, the certification is the NSF or ANSI standard 53. So you see like ANSI 53 or NSF 53. And so, in other words, for a filter to like pass that test to get this certification, to be able to say that it's ANSI 53 certified, it has to reduce the concentration of these chemicals beneath the level established by the EPA as being like non-hazardous, which is 70 parts per trillion. So, to be honest, like I'm not particularly confident that this filter is like entirely effective at reducing high concentrations of these chemicals in water over like long periods of exposure. They might be really great at reducing concentrations after like 4 fills of the pitcher, but after that they might be like completely useless. It might be the case that these filters basically become like saturated very quickly with these compounds and therefore need to be replaced more regularly than even the companies are suggesting we replace them, right? It's not like they were devised specifically to confront high concentrations of these chemicals in, drinking water. On the other hand, it may very well be the case that these chemicals that this group EWG detected may be largely like biologically insignificant for most people, So like, if you think about it this way, given the typical human lifespan and the fairly low concentrations of these chemicals in the water in most cases, that it's low enough to be comparable to like the risk that exposure to like UV rays from sunlight poses to our lifespan. So like, in other words, comparable to like risks posed by other things to which we're exposed naturally and we don't really consider to be like an imminent threat to our health, right? Also, as is the case with any report of this kind, it's important to consider the source of the findings, right? So the Environmental Working Group, again, the group that published this report, has been involved in many studies like this, right, of this kind. And, they have put out many warnings regarding the presence of various chemicals in the environment. And so, like most notoriously, they have this list of the dirty dozen, a list of produce that are, from their perspective, contaminated with various agricultural pesticides at a high frequency. And so this EWG, they've been subject to criticism from other groups. And these criticisms tend to focus on the assertion that EWG is largely fear-mongering, that they're like stoking paranoia by like portraying information in such a way as to provoke a fearful response from which then they can derive greater influence, attention, and funding. And so, I've come across a couple examples of these critiques. So like the most explicit one comes from a group called the American Council on Science and Health, or ACSH. ACSH. Oh, you know what? I have their logos. So that's EWG's logo right there. And that's the ACSH logo. And so, ACSH, they assert that the Environmental Working Group is stoking fear in the way I just described, right? And they go through various examples of how they're guilty of this, or at least from their perspective. So they list like EWG's focus on chemicals like BPA, arsenic, lead, perchlorate, asbestos, and so on. And like, honestly, I found the arguments from ACSH to be fairly weak. So like, just as an example, here's a quote from a page about the EWG by this American Council on Science and Health, right? So here's the quote. Quote, lead. Everybody agrees that lead is bad. Why is the EWG still raising money on it? End quote. That's fair enough that like most people by now are likely aware that lead is hazardous or like not something you want to consume. But like, tell that to the residents of Flint, Michigan, that because we all agree that lead is bad, we ought to not be overly concerned with the prospect of it being in municipal water, right? Just strikes me as like a fairly vacuous criticism. And so like another issue with the now American Council on Science and Health, right? So that's them, they're the ones criticizing this group, is that they evidently have received funding from corporate sources, right? Or people with relationships to various corporations like Chevron, Coca-Cola, Procter & Gamble, 3M, right? You get the picture. They're described as being industry friendly. And I don't think that they disagree with that description. And so in 1979, the information director of the FDA at the time, Wayne L. Pines, is quoted as saying the following in a People magazine article about the ACSH. Man. Quote, Whelan just makes blanket endorsements of food additives. Her organization is a sham, an industry front. End quote. So that's a pretty intense attack there. And so, to me, an organization being willing to like be skeptical of concerns that various chemicals are hazardous in a way that might ultimately be beneficial to an industry isn't like a problem in and of itself, right? So in other words, like I'm not generally very convinced by an argument that because an organization has arguably defended an industry, that they simply cannot be trusted, right? We live in a system with different entities that have different interests and are driven by different incentives, right? And so, again, I just don't find the argument that the American Council on Science and Health makes against the Environmental Working Group to be particularly convincing at all. But there are like certainly examples of overblown concern over various industrial activities, right? And so like another criticism, that was published in Salon, an outlet that's not known as being particularly industry protective, where the author named Jenny Splitter highlights that the EWG often describes levels of pesticides that are residual on produce, right, in that dirty dozen, that their descriptions can oftentimes actually be at levels that are lower than the tolerance levels set by the EPA, right? So in other words, the EPA has identified certain thresholds beyond which exposure can be dangerous, under which it's not dangerous, at least from their perspective. So, theoretically, the levels of pesticides that the EWG is describing as dirty or dangerous may actually be benign or non-toxic. And so Splitter also highlights that board members of the EWG have ties to industries that would benefit from the concerns that the group highlights. So, for example, one board member has used concerns raised over some sunscreens as associated with selling their own vitamin D supplement. Or like another example are ties to a company called The Honest Company, a brand with which many new parents might be familiar. They make diapers and shampoos and stuff that's marketed as being safer for babies. Free of a bunch of toxic or potentially toxic chemicals. And the EWG ranks The Honest Company as the best possible rating, right? They get the best possible rating. And again, they have these sort of like somewhat circuitous, but some ties, right? Some of the people that were involved in The Honest Company are also involved with the EWG. And so, again, just like with the ACSH, right? The group that was criticizing the EWG, these relationships aren't evidence that the group can't be trusted, right? It can be totally benign and arguably inevitable for these relationships to form, right? But it's just worth evaluating the landscape of these entities to get a good idea of where they're coming from and, what their backstories are. So for me, I just try and retreat to what the science tells us. And I can't know for sure how accurate EWG's water quality analysis is, for example, when compared to the EPA's, right? But as they articulate in the article, the EPA doesn't seem to have been particularly aggressive in monitoring for the presence of this broad family of compounds. And so I'm also not completely clear yet on the biomedical evidence that these chemicals are hazardous, at least at the levels to which we're exposed. And so I'm going to spend a little bit more time seeing what's out there, what kind of studies are available. But it's worth keeping in mind, however, like as I said before, that really scrupulous assessments of the effects of this family of chemicals is really difficult to do. And I'm not even sure that there's like tremendous levels of funding available for independent academic labs to perform those studies. It's frustrating, and this is the case for many compounds that are used in like industrial agriculture, for example. It's like a lot of hard work to evaluate their safeties. And just because those evaluations haven't been done doesn't mean that we can be confident that there are no hazards. And so, in my mind, I'm not particularly excited to like forgive exposure to any amount of this family of chemicals, particularly with a 1-year-old who's like ferociously working on developing her central nervous system, just so it's easier for me to clean eggs off a pan we use to cook our eggs, right? Just seems like a ridiculous trade-off, potentially. Particularly if we even try to avoid using non-stick pans and it just happens to be our water. And then even if we filter that water, and I'm not thrilled with the prospect of being unable to avoid exposure of my baby daughter to these chemicals no matter what I do. So anyways, after I do a little bit more reading on like the epidemiology of these chemicals, I'll be sure to update if there are any meaningful data. But apart from that, it's something worth keeping in mind. It's a story that made a big splash that got very prominent very rapidly. And when I first read it, I was immediately taken aback. But then when I got more into the details, I just began to wonder, right? And all the things that I just described, like, okay, so it's 70 parts per trillion is the EPA level. Here, I can show you that again. Boom, boom, boom. So you can see here, like the EPA threshold is 70 parts per trillion, and EWG is arguing that it ought to be closer to 1. Maybe there's a great reason for that. Also, 70 parts per trillion, that's very dilute. Like, that's not very many parts per trillion. But the counter argument to that is that these compounds don't really break down at a rate that would suggest that like you can be exposed to have a sort of a trickle of exposure to these chemicals, but you sort of eliminate them from your body quickly enough that they don't like wreak havoc. They're not present in your body at substantial concentrations. Another thing that I wanted to highlight, so I tweeted out this article, and there were a bunch of responses, which were, some of which were funny, some of which were depressing. But one of them was like, everybody should be boiling their water, which can be effective at removing organic, some organic contaminants like, bacteria and so on. It can help to kill the bacteria. But when it comes to compounds like this, you actually don't want to boil your water, because what that does is as the water evaporates off, those compounds are not evaporating with it. And so what you're really doing is just concentrating those chemicals, because you're getting less water for the amount of those compounds present in the water, right? So, there's like some kind of intuitive aspects to how you might confront an issue like this. So, I'm going to keep my eye out and see if there's any more insights regarding like what levels ought to be concerning. Another, concern is that they only did that one sort of snapshot evaluation of the concentration of these compounds in the water, and past, evaluations have shown that like the concentrations of these PFAS compounds in water can fluctuate pretty wildly, like from 40, which the EPA would consider non-problematic, to like over 300 in certain municipalities. And so, that's a pretty gigantic fluctuation. And so, I hope that the EPA or municipal governments or whatever, some organizations, a part of the government, has a kind of game plan for how they're going to address this issue. Just given the fact, like as I said, these compounds don't break down at a rate that's meaningful, really. They're even informally referred to as forever chemicals, just because they don't break down. And so I'm hoping that they're monitoring for this, and there's some kind of approach to maybe ensuring that we're monitoring more regularly, or that certain parts of the country are very heavily associated with this. I mean, as you can see in this graph, I know the text is a little bit small, but like some cities or counties or whatever municipalities have rather high concentrations, and some have zero. Like I think Tuscaloosa, Alabama had like basically zero. So, there might be just like different kind of approaches depending upon what the local industries are in the area, and of course, water quality testing. Anyway, so that's what I have prepared for today, and I admit I was up a bit late again last night because, the baby had a terrible night's sleep the night before, and, and I was trying to, as I was reading more and more into this, I started reading into like the reputations of these different organizations, and, I just wanted to make sure that the whole picture was there. So you'll have to forgive me if I'm a little sluggish. It's also the baby's nap time, so you might be hearing a little bit of crying. Don't worry, there's no PFAS involved. Anyways, okay, so let's start the live half. Go. Hello, everybody. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I am a PhD in neuroscience at the University of Pennsylvania. Oops. And on YouTube, I just talked about a recent article that came out that was covered in like BuzzFeed and so on, that was performed by a group called the Environmental Working Group that found high concentrations or higher concentrations than expected of a whole family of chemicals that are used to produce things like Teflon in the water of a bunch of different cities, including Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., New Jersey had a bunch of different cities. And it's essentially all throughout the country. And so I talked about that and some of the concerns regarding the groups that are making articles on both sides of this issue. And so you can find that if you'd like. You can search like Ian, anthropoid, brain, or something like that, and you'll probably find it. Okay, so so why are so many people impacted by the death of Kobe Bryant? Well, I can't speak for other people. I know when I was young, on the basketball team in high school, believe it or not, Kobe Bryant was like a superhero, and sort of like he was playing at a level that was kind of just shocking. He was just such a dominant player, and yeah, people form relationships with whom they respect. And I think also just sort of like the randomness of it. But yeah, it's tragic either way. Regardless, even if this person, even if it wasn't a famous basketball player, of course it's tragic. But I can't speak to other folks. Hey, and do you know of Wim Hof and his method? Yeah, I'm familiar with Wim Hof. I know he's been like referred to as like the Iceman, or he's been able to demonstrate remarkable tolerances to shockingly low temperatures, and he's able to like hold his breath for quite a long time. And he makes this argument that through this kind of very specific breathing regimen, you can manipulate like your immune system and so on. I haven't really seen any kind of like scrupulous assessments of the like viability of those methods. I mean, so on the one hand, like there are many relationships between respiration, in other words, our breathing, and a bunch of different aspects of our central nervous system. Like the near and dearest to my heart, given that I study addiction and anxiety, is a relationship between respiratory rate and levels of anxiety and stress. So that's just one example, right? And of course, there's a bunch of indirect relationships that can blossom from that. But from my perspective, all the only things I've seen about Wim Hof, the only media associated with it, seemed very kind of outrageous, almost like just very difficult to verify, and not really being evaluated by a scientist. And I know there have been like some measurements of various biomolecules, the levels of them fluctuating as a function of like his various exercises. But yeah, I would like to see like a study done in a lab that over a long period of time that controls for as many variables as possible. And also it'd be interesting to know more about his perhaps he has rather unique physiology. Mutations can occur. So yeah, I've approached that whole story with skepticism, although I have to admit I haven't like really scrutinized the literature to see if there have been some rigorously conducted science. Okay. You're not a fan. I have an amazing tolerance to THC and cocaine. Well, I wouldn't be too proud of that. Any human exposed to any drug for a long enough period of time will develop a tolerance. There is some truth to the argument that there are biological predispositions to being more or less tolerant to various drugs, alcohol most notoriously perhaps. Some people can just are less inebriated at a given dose than other folks. And that's probably true for other drugs like THC, just given the variable genetics underlying the cannabinoid receptors in our brain. But yeah, I wouldn't be too impressed. Okay, I don't know anything about the NBA, but I was shocked. Yeah. I mean, sorry, I assume you're referring to the news that Kobe Bryant died in a helicopter accident. Yeah, I mean, it's just I think part, at least for me, part of it is like that's so weird. Like it's just so surprising. Like, it's basketball isn't particularly like life-threatening profession, so in some cases you might like not be surprised if like a very ambitious rock climber who like free climbs hundreds of feet without any kind of like without being tied in, if somebody like that dies, then it's like that's still tragic, of course, but it's like, yeah, I mean, you're sort of assessing those threats or those risks, and when it's just a helicopter accident, it's just it's just, I think part of it is how like out of nowhere it came from. Hello, Doc. How are you doing? I am doing well, thank you very much. I'm just another human. Congrats, Ian McLaughlin, PhD. Thank you very much. I'm doing okay. I unfortunately was up unforgivably late last night reading into this story about PFAS compounds present in in like municipal drinking water all throughout the country. And so, yeah, I'm a little bit tired. But I was able to sleep in. So it's not all bad. Weightlifting, sleeping well, healthy food, better overall mental health. Yeah. It's pretty true. Exercise in general. Okay, how does Adderall work? Sure. So Adderall is amphetamine, essentially. It's the sort of brand name for amphetamine, specifically dextroamphetamine. So in chemistry, you can have very, very similar molecules. They have all the same atoms arranged almost in entirely the same way, but there can be like a hydrogen pointing out that way, on one version of the molecule, whereas it points out this way on the other version of the molecule. So one of those would be dextroamphetamine, and that's the one that is in Adderall, and they have slightly different pharmacologies, the various stereoisomers of amphetamine. Anyways, doesn't really matter. Just food for nerd thought. So Adderall as amphetamine, it operates similarly to other psychomotor stimulants like cocaine or like methylphenidate, which is what is in Ritalin. It increases the signaling of specific monoamine neurotransmitters that are called catecholamines, with which you might be quite familiar. Dopamine, for example, is probably one of the most famous neurotransmitters, and that is the principal neurotransmitter that Adderall, methylphenidate, Adderall or amphetamine, methylphenidate or Ritalin influence, and they elevate the release of those neurotransmitters in a specific circuit of the brain called the mesocortical limbic dopaminergic system. And so that system is that circuit in our brain. Just to give you an idea of the geography, or the anatomy, is there are a bunch of neurons in basically the part of the brain that is like where the brainstem connects to the cerebrum, to the large part of the wrinkly large part of the brain. And that part of that region is called the ventral tegmental area. And there's a bunch of dopamine producing neurons in that region that are that fire more impulses, fire more action potentials when amphetamine is on board. And what happens then, and so those neurons form this circuit, the mesocortical limbic circuit, and that circuit is responsible for essentially the expectation of reward. So in other words, like the reason that you'll engage in one behavior over another is that you expect it might yield better outcomes for you, be it, you'll feel better, as in the case of using drugs, or, I should focus on studying this material so that I get a good grade on my test so that I, can do well in school or whatever. Part of the sort of outcome of that signaling is that it'll determine just how long you can focus on any given task, right? And so, unsurprisingly, perhaps for many people, when that part of the brain is activated or influenced by a drug like Adderall or amphetamine, they're able to focus on a given task for much longer than they would otherwise. So that can be quite useful for somebody who's diagnosed with ADHD, where it's comparatively more difficult for them to focus on a given task for as long as other folks. And people will react differently to a drug like Adderall, depending upon their unique, brain architecture, their brain anatomy. But that's basically how it works. At a more granular level, it does essentially two things. First, it can bind dopamine receptors itself, sort of like masquerading as a neurotransmitter, but it also will just cause the release of more dopamine itself into the synaptic cleft. So more dopamine can bind dopamine receptors. Is there any tolerance to consider? Yeah, to Adderall, for sure. Like many of the drugs that influence this part of the brain. By the way, so essentially any drug that somebody does for fun voluntarily will have somewhat of a similar effect. So any drug you can name, nicotine, alcohol, heroin, because again, this circuit is involved in the expectation of reward. Oftentimes, it's kind of overly simplified as being like the reward circuit. It's not quite reward, but it feels rewarding. Caffeine also, yes, will enhance catecholamine signaling in a very different mechanism than Adderall or methylphenidate. It's a very interesting mechanism, but the end result is, yes, elevated catecholamine signaling, and therefore energy and ability to focus on a task. But yeah, so, principally the most proximal effect of Adderall or amphetamine is that it can bind dopamine receptors and it increases the release of dopamine itself. And then the downstream consequence of that is this circuit that's involved in our ability to focus on a task or motivation to focus on a task is amplified. So yeah. Oh, and then tolerance, sorry, I kind of skipped over that. So just like with essentially all those drugs, the chronic presence of any drug will induce neuroplastic adaptations in the brain. So in other words, the brain will kind of respond to the chronic presence of that drug. Essentially, it'll adapt to basically reapproach what we call homeostasis, or reapproach its kind of baseline function. In other words, what it would look like it had the brain never been exposed to the drug in the first place. And that is part of the reason for why we develop tolerance to any drug, caffeine included, alcohol, nicotine, It can change the number of receptors present that the drug can bind, and therefore that the neurotransmitters can bind. It can change the number of synaptic connections between different parts of the brain, and the end result of that is that you require a higher dose to achieve a desired effect. However, because so that dynamic drives the kind of classic escalation of dose that people addicted to a drug will generally exhibit. So people who drink alcohol, because they're pursuing this rewarding effect, this euphoric effect of alcohol, they'll tend to escalate how much alcohol they'll drink because, again, they're developing a tolerance. However, when it comes to the sort of clinical application of Adderall, it's slightly different. There can be a tolerance that develops, but because the desired effect is not the reward or the euphoria, rather it's that elevated ability to focus on a task, and because of the kind of dosage, the dosing schedule of the medication that's described by certain physicians, the tolerance, it just doesn't function in quite the same way. And in fact, with a lot of stimulants, you can actually have a sensitization to the effects of the drug. And this is true for cocaine, very interestingly, that after repeated exposures in certain frequencies, certain schedules, an organism can actually become more sensitive to the drug than they were previously. All right. What brings you joy? Well, right now, what brings me joy is playing with my daughter. She's like a month over a year old. So I guess that makes her 13 months old. I always got frustrated when new parents would you'd ask how old their baby is, and they're like, oh, 27 months. And it's like, what? You mean, like, just over 2 years, So, often I'm probably neurotically focused on trying to protect her anonymity and privacy as much as possible, given that she doesn't really have a choice, that's why, I haven't posted any pictures of her. And I also I've only shared her name with people that I know reasonably well. And it's probably, again, neurotic, but I feel like her generation may be the last generation on Earth that actually has a say in whether or not they can maintain anonymity. And even then, it's probably folly, right? We probably have no choice at this point, given all the AI that's associated with surveillance cameras and stuff like that. But, if I can influence whether or not she has anonymity when she gets older, I feel like I should try and maintain it if I can. So, your dog? What do you mean, my dog? Can meditation change the mind? Well, certainly, but it can change the mind, much like essentially any, recurring behavior will change the mind, right? Staring at a white wall for, an hour every day will also have an effect on the mind, right? I suspect, and I'm sure you'll appreciate that I'm being a little cheeky, as our friends in the UK might say, but, I'm sure that you're interested, does meditation have a beneficial effect on the mind? And there are mixed results. The issue with meditation research is that a lot of it is what we would call low quality. And that doesn't mean that they're bad scientists that are performing the studies, but rather it's it's science that's difficult to control, as much as other forms of neuroscience and psychology research. But there have been studies that have been performed that suggest that specifically mindfulness associated meditation, there's many different meditation practices, and arguably certain spiritual practices, certain prayer, traditions also have a meditative component to them. But, mindfulness meditation is a certain kind of form of meditation. There's sort of different schools, probably the most well-known, domain of meditation is transcendental meditation, but that's just one example. There's also it's sort of like judo compared to jiu-jitsu, right? Where judo is sort of like an extraction of various techniques from jiu-jitsu. Mindfulness meditation is sort of an extraction of some of the techniques that are used in vipassana and, again, transcendental meditation and so on. And it has essentially zero kind of metaphysical or spiritual component to it. It's more just like a kind of a mind exercise. I've taken a class in it. Oh, and to get back to the studies. So there have been some studies. The most notable in my mind is one that was performed at Johns Hopkins University, one of the best medical institutions in the world. It's not better than University of Pennsylvania, but I mean, come on. That's where I work, by the way. But anyways, so it was an evaluation of the effect of mindfulness meditation on people who are diagnosed with anxiety-associated conditions. And what they found was after, a prolonged period of time that these folks were doing mindfulness meditation, they found that there were, statistically significant reductions in their symptoms of anxiety. And I believe they also collected stress-associated, endocrine system indicators like, cortisol levels. But it's also worth noting that like other participant groups within that study, people who were not diagnosed with anxiety-associated conditions, didn't actually exhibit these reductions of anxiety, right? So it seems like you already had to be kind of predisposed to anxiety to exhibit those benefits. Now, from my perspective, you can learn a lot that's useful from mindfulness meditation. For me, the greatest benefit was that we're sort of like at the whim of the kind of constant cognitive train, right? Like our subconscious kind of delivers things that we're going to think about to our conscious attention, and we don't really have much say in the matter, right? I study some parts of the brain that are involved in that kind of subconscious processing that can kind of steer the boat of your conscious awareness. And one of the kind of goals or exercises of mindfulness meditation is to sort of observe that kind of constant train of attention and thought topics, and kind of training yourself to observe it happen and not necessarily, and sort of have a little bit more choice in the matter, right? And sort of observe these potential focuses of your attention kind of bubble up, and then, you watch it bubble away. And actually I kind of use that visualization, despite the fact that I have aphantasia. I suspect I'm very bad at visualizing, but I sort of use that as a heuristic to kind of, make this very, very intangible and nebulous process a little bit more tangible. I'm sort of sitting in like a pond or whatever body of water, and I'm watching these thoughts bubble by me, and I'm deciding to not, partake. Anyway, so that for me is probably, if there are benefits to that, they're probably very difficult to quantify. But yeah, the most rigorously assessed benefits or potential benefits of meditation were the ones that I mentioned from that Johns Hopkins review. Okay. We have a caller. Let's see. I got my paper here. All right, so creative group. I believe we talked last time. What's your name and where are you calling from?
Yeah, creative group is my business. Thank you, Ian, for accepting me. Really appreciate it, and thank you for remembering that you do have a person that you're having up, and there's no surprises when they come on. You have a couple of trolls that are currently in your feed, and I think they're coming together and they're saying the same thing. Hopefully your moderator will block them. But you had a question that piqued my interest in regards to, within the comments, in regards to Gabapentin, which has various uses. What is that use of the Gabapentin? And what are the side effects that may harm the body if you are aware of it?
Yeah.
Thank you, and I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, thanks for calling in. So Gabapentin is, as the name sort of implies, it is a medication or a drug that is principally inhibitory. And it's sort of like so GABA is the nervous system's principal inhibitory neurotransmitter. It's like it's kind of like one side of the tug of war between whether or not, that determines whether or not a neuron will or will not fire an impulse. And so, for example, benzodiazepines like Xanax or Valium or Klonopin, they all enhance signaling of GABA and sort of calm down signaling between neurons. GABA itself is incapable of crossing the blood-brain barrier. So you can eat GABA and almost none of it is actually going to get into the brain. But if you tweak the molecule this way or that and generate something sort of like gabapentin, then you can have a molecule that sort of masquerades as GABA once it gets into the brain and kind of inhibits signaling writ large throughout the entire brain. It's pretty non-selective. So gabapentin has been used to treat conditions like epilepsy in the past. It has also been recently shown to be useful in the treatment of certain anxiety-associated conditions, and not as a sort of frontline treatment, but as an option, particularly for people with severe treatment-resistant anxiety. It's also been shown to be helpful in some cases in pain management. So people who have chronic pain, the use of gabapentin can help to moderate that pain. So some of the side effects of gabapentin are going to be the side effects that a lot of GABAergic or GABA associated drugs will have. And so that's things like, it can be inebriating a little bit. It can influence your judgment a little bit, particularly at higher doses. And it's sedating a little bit. Like essentially all of these drugs, again, you can develop a tolerance to the effects of the drug. And so you might have to escalate that dose. And there can be a substance dependence, not necessarily an addiction, but because of that tolerance to the drug, once, stopping treatment with gabapentin is something that a physician should be monitoring, because like with many or essentially all GABAergic drugs that people use, once you develop a tolerance or, once you've been taking it for a long time, your brain has adapted to the chronic presence of that drug. And so once you remove the drug from the system, you have, because those inhibitory drugs, those GABAergic drugs, were sort of playing the role of GABA in some, is one way to think of it, or at least enhancing GABA signaling, the brain will reduce its own GABAergic signaling. And so, again, to reapproach homeostasis, like what we were talking about with more like addictive drugs. And so once you stop taking gabapentin, you can have a withdrawal syndrome, or you will have a withdrawal syndrome. And if you are taking high doses of it regularly, that can be potentially dangerous, right? There's a risk of seizure. So that's sort of like the primary concern, I would imagine. But yeah, just like with all GABAergic drugs, inebriation, sedation, those types of side effects can be an issue too. It is like placebo in some cases for those diagnosed with nerve problems considered mental. Yeah, right. That's indeed in some cases, right? Some chronic pain associated conditions like fibromyalgia, for example, in some cases can respond favorably to psychiatric treatment. That doesn't mean that the pain isn't real. It's just it's generated by something apart from like a specific physical source of inflammation or whatever. So yeah. Oh my gosh, we have Othman calling in, I believe. So I've known Othman now for a pretty long time. Othman, are you there? And where are you calling from?
Hey, Ian. How's it going?
Good. How are you? Are you in Saudi Arabia?
Yes, where the oil erupts. Actually, the first oil field is, it's like 5 miles away.
Wow.
Anyways, I'm a big fan of your podcast, as you might know. And I think when I listened to, I think last time you uploaded was a long time ago.
Yeah.
And actually, I'm curious. Yeah, I'm curious when you are going to upload the next, because when I had my course in psychology, it was like an elective course I took in college. I recommend your podcast to everyone in class, including the professor. He was Canadian. He was like professor in industrial psychology.
That's awesome. Thanks, man.
Yeah, and he liked it very much. So I'm curious, when are you going to release the next season, I guess?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, so the reason that the frequency went down to 0 for a while is because I was finishing the PhD and I was doing a lot of writing and so on. Not in the not too distant future. So I'm going to start.
Okay, don't get a rush. I know you have like family and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, I mean, like there are certain things that I've been wanting to like cover, and so one thing that I'm thinking about, and I know for people who don't have babies this must be like kind of boring, but one of the things that's difficult when you have a baby is like what to do with their sleep schedule. And there's this whole concept of sleep training where you sort of let the baby cry quite a bit, and then eventually they'll start sleeping more predictably. But there are some like arguments for and against sleep training, and I kind of wanted to talk about that. Of course, another topic is microdosing with psychedelics, this sort of kind of new phenomenon of people taking very, very small doses of drugs like LSD or psilocybin and so on. Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of things that I've been wanting to do, and I'm planning on starting to work on those beginning of this week. So, yeah, baby permitting, there should be a new episode pretty soon. I really appreciate you bringing up the podcast with the folks you know. That's really nice to hear.
So by
Yeah, thanks for calling, Othman. It's wonderful to talk to you. Have a good week.
Bye bye.
How cool is that? Oh, okay. We have another caller. Oh, it's Diane. Okay. Okay. So Diane, if I'm wrong, please correct me. But Diane, where are you calling from?
Pembroke Pines, Florida.
Very cool. From Pembroke Pines, Florida. What's on your mind?
We have a new vitamin, turmeric,
Yep.
curcumin.
Mm-hmm.
It's supposed to help with depression.
Huh.
Do you want the spelling?
No, I know exactly what you're talking about. So, and who suggested that you use it for depression?
I found it.
Okay. So turmeric, for anybody that's not familiar, is a spice or, an ingredient that has been used in probably like most closely associated with like curry or Indian food, from India. And within turmeric is a molecule called curcumin, which has been shown to have some really interesting properties. People who consume diets that are rich in turmeric tend to exhibit lower frequencies of like neurodegenerative disorders, and it has some interesting antioxidant properties. It has been evaluated for potential utility in managing things like cognitive impairment and dementia. Now, all of that said, I mean, and there's some compelling evidence to suggest that it does have some useful properties. All of that said, when it comes to the supplement industry, people are permitted, it's totally legal to make claims about their products that they don't have to prove actually deliver those effects, right? So, just to give you an idea, and it's because the supplement industry is regulated differently than the pharmaceutical industry. And so just to give you an idea, like it would be legal for me to take some turmeric, put it into some capsules, and say that because it's antioxidant, that it will extend your lifespan. That would be legal. But just so long as I'm not poisoning you when you take it, that would, nobody would stop me from doing that. So generally speaking, when it comes to supplements that are marketed for all these various reasons, it's generally prudent to be a little bit skeptical. You can be optimistically skeptical, but I've never seen any evidence to suggest that turmeric has any benefits for the treatment of depression. And of course, depression is a life-threatening condition. Rates of suicide are increasing in the United States, and depression is a major cause of suicidality or suicidal thoughts. It's the kind of thing where if somebody's suspects that they have depression or a loved one has depression, really the best thing to do is to talk to, a medical specialist, a psychiatrist or a psychologist. And, you can bring up like, hey, what do you think about this turmeric? So long as you're talking to somebody who has training in treating depression, you'll ensure that you're taking the safest steps possible. But turmeric is great. I add it to a lot of my food. Because it tastes good, but also it has some of these potential health benefits. But I wouldn't be too confident that it's particularly helpful for depression, Diane.
Okay, so you're saying there's no real studies on turmeric for the brain and depression?
Well, so for depression in particular, at least I haven't seen any evidence that it's beneficial for depression. And frankly, I would be kind of surprised if it were. But yeah, I've not seen any evidence to suggest that it's antidepressant in any way. No.
Okay, I have one more question.
Okay.
According to the label, they're saying it's mixed with hormones. So, hormones and depression all go together. And they're mixing the curcumin, if I'm pronouncing that right, which has a lot to do with the bile and the digestive system.
So, I'm not sure what's in that product. I mean, so curcumin, it's almost certainly benign to health. And again, some studies have shown that it might be beneficial for a variety of maladies. And, I would be very, very surprised if there were any hormones that were present in this supplement. It's not unheard of, but I'd be very surprised. It is true that there are relationships between endocrine signaling, hormone levels, and mood and depression. So, that's not outrageous to suggest, but, I've never heard of any physician who, when somebody comes in for depression, their first response is to prescribe some hormones, whether it's testosterone or estrogen or whatever it might be. That doesn't mean that these hormones have no effect on mood. And in many cases for men, low testosterone can be associated with depression and so on. But generally speaking, to treat depression, you don't do it through the endocrine system. And there may be some interactions between turmeric, curcumin, and the endocrine system. That's totally possible. That wouldn't surprise me. But the notion that any supplement is going to predictably influence hormone levels is, again, I'm skeptical of those claims.
Thank you, Ian. Love you.
Thank you so much for calling, Diane, as always.
Bye.
Bye. All right. Do you believe that we can rewire our brain through meditation to the point of a new identity? That's so very interesting. So first of all, yes. I mean, the whole concept behind psychotherapy is that you can rewire the brain. Now, that's sort of informal terminology, right? Your brain is being rewired all the time, right? Not the entire structure of the brain, but, new connections are being formed, old connections are being pruned away or are being suppressed or depressed. So that's a natural phenomenon. And, one way to think about it is that dynamic is constantly occurring. And, whatever you feed into the mind will influence how that process, the trajectory of that process, right? So if all you're doing is watching reality TV shows, your brain is being rewired, right? It's not the rewiring itself that's beneficial. It's what's influencing the rewiring. And meditation certainly would be one, routine that would have an effect there. Now, when you bring up identity, so that is an extremely complex topic in human psychology and in neuroscience. Different disciplines have different kind of notions of identity. Cultural identity, self-identity, gender identity, all of these various aspects of your conception of self, given that life experiences certainly can influence identity, I don't see why something like meditation couldn't have an effect. But when you say like the reason I'm sort of parsing my words here is that like I don't suspect that one can develop like a completely like a schism in their identity, and all of a sudden I'll think that I am like a sheep herder in Peru, that's what I mean. But like certainly I could develop greater empathy for others or reduce empathy for others depending upon the nature of what I'm doing with that meditation. But yeah, I mean, fundamentally I do agree with that argument. All right. Yeah, I know, it's so tragic, the Kobe Bryant story. It's like it's hard to articulate, like I guess it would be kind of similar to like kids in high school maybe a couple of years ago at this point, and LeBron James, like just such a dominant player, athlete, and of course particularly young people, but most of the country, I suppose, looks to athletes as role models, and they're extraordinarily influential, and Kobe Bryant was certainly an example. It's tragic. Okay. What do you think of the coronavirus? Yeah, super interesting topic. So the coronavirus is interesting. It is a new species of virus, or like at least a novel virus. And for anybody that's not familiar with this story, there has been this kind of emergence, the spread of this virus, principally in China, but it's infected, I think, about 500 people worldwide, and it's beyond China at this point. Principally in China, a part of the country called Wuhan, but now people have been diagnosed as being infected with it in Hong Kong, which is, I guess from the perspective of China, part of China, from the perspective of Hong Kong, not so much, but Hong Kong, South Korea, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, Japan, and
very recently the United States. I think there's been 2 cases of people infected with the virus. And so the coronavirus, it's interesting. And I think we're still in a phase where we're learning more and more about how this virus works. But it initially will induce sort of flu-like symptoms. And there's this range of severity. And in some cases, it can permanently damage the lungs. And so as of January 20th, there were 278 cases in China specifically. And the highest concentration, again, it was in Wuhan, in an area called the Hubei province. And so of those cases, 51 of the cases were severely ill. 12 were in critical condition. And I think the latest death toll was 9 people. And so very meaningfully, yesterday was the Chinese New Year. They follow a more lunar calendar. And so yesterday, the 25th of January was the Chinese New Year. And the Chinese New Year is actually, and I've heard it described as a period of the year where there's the highest human migration yearly, right? So the greatest number of humans are moving from one part of the world to another. Generally speaking, it's Chinese people who live in urban areas, traveling back to, oftentimes further westward or into more rural areas where they have more family. And because of all of that travel, there can be, as is the case with essentially any infectious disease, greater travel can be associated with greater transmission. So back to the virus. So the coronavirus is kind of similar but distinct to you might remember SARS, which is like the severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus, right? So it's a coronavirus also, but it was a distinct one. And then there's another one that was called MERS, or the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome coronavirus. So MERS, SARS, these are related but distinct from this new coronavirus. Genetically, they're distinct. And so one of the kind of principal things that it induces is pneumonia. And I think a lot of people think of pneumonia as like its own infectious disease, but it's not, right? It's just an infection that induces respiratory symptoms, and it can be induced by infection with a variety of infectious agents like bacteria or viruses. And essentially, what happens is like the air sacs in the lungs fill up with fluid, So when it comes to this coronavirus, the symptoms kind of resemble pneumonia. And, there's respiratory distress where, again, the lungs fill with fluid and so on. But then other maladies can arise as well as a function of this coronavirus, which is like sepsis, which is essentially just like bacterial infection of the blood of the circulatory system, very, very life-threatening. And then septic shock, which is when the organs actually fail due to the sepsis. Again, the symptoms just basically resemble like, you just got sick, like you're sort of run-of-the-mill infection where you have like a runny nose, you have a sore throat, you're coughing, you have shortness of breath, or you're like breathing more frequently. Part of how it can be diagnosed or whatever. So part of how doctors will sometimes put that I always forget what it's called. Like the little tool that they have, with the ears and the listening puck. What is that thing called? Stethoscope. Very funny. Anyways, so a doctor can, they can listen to your respiratory system, and they'll be able to tell, at least they'll get an indication of just how severe the respiratory symptoms are. There's this range of severity. Like some people they just feel like they have the flu and then they're fine. Some people die. And so that is, always alarming. So in other words, it can just be like a mild pneumonia or it can lead to death. It doesn't seem like they have a great handle on what it is that determines whether or not somebody's facing, confronting a potentially fatal infection versus like a kind of mild, easily treatable one. Apart from like probably what, the standard kind of demographics are, elderly folks and people who are particularly young children are generally speaking most vulnerable to these types of infectious agents. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's concerning just because of the time of year. And, I think that the advice for people is, particularly if you've traveled to Wuhan recently, like in the past 14 days, you might just want to go to the hospital or at least go to a doctor and just get evaluated. But then the standard stuff like washing your hands, covering your mouth. By the way, when you cough, this is good etiquette, or sneeze, a lot of people, cover their face with their hand, and that's better than nothing. But actually what you should be doing is using your sleeve, because you touch things with your hands, and generally speaking, you're not manipulating stuff with your sleeves. The crelbo, whatever you want to call this, the inside of your elbow. So yeah, that's coronavirus. It's something that, I'm sure we're going to learn more about as time goes on, just like, the whole SARS scare. But yeah, it's potentially, rather serious. It can be fatal. So, yeah. But, as I said, in the United States, there are very few cases so far. But because of that giant migration that happens for Chinese New Year, it's just something that's going to be monitored. And I know that they're doing very rigorous checks in China. They essentially locked down travel in Wuhan. And I have some friends that live in Shanghai, and they're saying that very few people are out in the streets now, and everybody, it's kind of like, I went to China a few years ago at this point, and it's kind of surprising to see, but a lot of people just wear those face masks just in general. And my friend in Shanghai said that everybody's wearing them now. It's standard fare. But yeah, we're not at that level of concern in the United States, but it's something that I know that, the CDC is monitoring. Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. I can't believe I forgot about that. They say there isn't any symptoms at first. Is that true? Well, again, this virus has not been thoroughly characterized yet, but from what I've seen described, basically the early symptoms just resemble a flu. And yeah, I mean, you don't have immediate symptoms when you're infected by a lot of things, but you might suspect that you just have the flu or something, maybe a pretty bad case of the flu. And so, yeah, particularly if you have been exposed to folks who, live in Wuhan or in China or whatever, or have been there recently, and you get sick, it's just something to keep in mind. So yeah, people in China travel to the United States regularly, students on U.S. campuses. Oh, for sure. Yeah. And that's wonderful. That's great. But yeah, it's just this emergence of this virus is sort of a, a novel concern, but fortunately we have, organizations like the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, and they're remarkably apt. I've seen presentations on their disaster response plans, and it's very cool. They have the sort of the Avengers, which is a bunch of people, experts at universities and scientists that are activated, and it's very cool. And just like we saw their response to the Ebola threat that emerged, I'm sure that they're mobilized similarly for this coronavirus, and I'm sure there's probably some collaboration at least between the two countries. Okay, does coronavirus have something to do with Lyme disease? No, I haven't seen any suggestion that there's any relationship there. It's rather more similar to SARS or MERS, right? These are other coronaviruses that are sort of in the same family of viruses, but they're genetically somewhat different. Yeah, so that's what it's most similar to. Okay, all right, am I real? Man, that's deep, dude. You're blowing my mind, dude. As far as I'm aware, I am real. I have to make only one assumption from which every other thing that I can think about in the universe emerges, and that is that I am real. If you can't assume that, then it's tough to assume anything. Okay. Aren't they? Oh, hey, what's up, Zaina? Good to see you. Yes, aren't they aiming to build 2 hospitals in 10 days? I saw a report, and there's actually, I think Vice did a very short video on it, that they're building a hospital in Wuhan in 6 days, which is wild. But it's a different system over there in China. But yeah, I mean, it's clear that they're definitely responding. So hope that they confront the issue effectively. Are you real? That was great. Oh, right. Okay. So we have, I suspect, you'll have to correct me if I'm wrong, Chris from San Francisco. What's on your mind?
Yeah. First of all, I just like to concur with what you said earlier. A listening puck is the technical term for stethoscope.
How dare you? I corrected myself.
No, that is the correct term. Also, question, and I'll hang up to hear the answer. Can my mind in any way influence the outcome of the Super Bowl, or can the players' minds influence the outcome? In other words, will my Niners be guaranteed to win? Thank you for your answer.
Well, it's a tough question. I wouldn't put it past somebody as mentally powerful as Chris in San Francisco to be able to influence the outcome of like a pseudo-religious event in the United States, the Super Bowl. But I wouldn't bank on it. In other words, I wouldn't put money on it. All right. Let's see. Not gay, bro, but if I was, I would be. I'm not sure what you mean by that. That's a amusing handle you got there. Okay, how can you tell regular age-related memory loss versus oncoming dementia? Yeah, I mean, that is a super valid concern, and it's an interesting topic. So, I mean, pragmatically speaking, there is a cognitive test that probably a neurologist or a neuropsychologist will administer, and they will evaluate basically your cognitive performance relative to other people your age. Well, within your demographic, I guess. And depending upon your score, they'll be able to tell whether or not this is, more advanced, neurodegeneration or at least dementia, or just the sort of standard, steady deterioration of our cognitive function that we all face as fragile primates, right? And so, in other words, like there is an anticipated degradation of our cognitive acuity basically after like the age of like 27, 30. So I'm already on that train. And boy, I can tell. But so anatomically speaking, this can be shown, right? This can be demonstrated that like a certain kind of neuron, spindle neurons, begin to deteriorate slightly as we get older. And in fact, various aggregates can accumulate in the brain, even if one doesn't develop Alzheimer's disease. So Alzheimer's disease is, I think, the most common form. Well, it is the most common form of dementia that is associated with two specific aggregates or like clumps, buildup of various biomolecules, amyloid beta plaques and neurofibrillary tangles. And in fact, folks can have amyloid beta plaques and not have Alzheimer's disease, not even exhibit dementia. So these types of accumulations can occur over time, given enough time. So in any case, yeah, I mean, that's the best way you can tell is to go to a physician if you're concerned that you have dementia or you're developing dementia. And, the earlier you respond, the better. But just a sort of a minor memory loss is not in and of itself necessarily a valid cause of tremendous concern. But, there are various things. I mean, like, even if you're concerned about, maybe it's not dementia, but hey, I'm not as cognitively sharp as I could be. There are things that you can do. And so, a recent finding, and I talked about this last Sunday, fairly recent, within the last couple of years, was that actually cardiovascular exercise is beneficial at staving off the onset of dementia. For the longest time, it was like this vexing sort of finding that there hadn't been any studies that found a beneficial effect of cardiovascular exercise on dementia. And it was just like this weird thing that like, we know that this is a healthy thing. Like, there are so many benefits, but why is it not correlated with, these cognitive benefits? And there was just this gigantic study that was done. It was actually, I think, a meta review, so an analysis of a ton of studies. And they found that, yes, actually, indeed, it is beneficial. And it was something like 20 minutes a day of medium intensity exercise, like 3 times a week. And they had sort of like different recommendations for different ages. But so, exercising, obviously, forcing your mind to solve new problems, exposing yourself to ideas with which you might disagree, learning new things, learning new languages, new, ways to dance or whatever, just exposing your brain to novel environments, novel problems, beneficial. Social isolation is another thing that is definitely life-threatening. In fact, I think it was Vivek Murthy, the former Surgeon General of the United States. He, I believe, characterized social isolation as like equally life-threatening to I can't remember what he compared it to, but like depression or maybe it was even something even like more like, you know, tangible, like diabetes or something. I can't remember specifically his comparison, but like, you know, social isolation is definitely a hazard to health. And when it comes to cognitive acuity and dementia, social isolation is one of the like main risk factors for folks as we get older. I mean, you know, I think it can be kind of easy for us to become more isolated as we get older, unfortunately. So, you know, ensuring that you're not, you know, too isolated, that you're interacting with people. The other thing is a recent, well, not that recent, but of all the various dietary trends or dietary components that have been evaluated for their effects on the brain, one that has been associated with an increased risk of dementia is a diet that's very, very high in simple carbohydrates, or basically sugar. There's really no redeemable quality of sugar other than it tastes good. And unless you're like a high performance athlete, and I mean like a high performance athlete, you know, sugar really has no utility apart from improving your quality of life, which is, you know, it's not nothing. But yeah, so, you know, diets that are high in simple carbohydrates can be associated with an increased risk of dementia. But, you know, if you're concerned, you know, the best thing to do, particularly if you're above the age of 65, is to go to a physician and, you know, get, you know, ask, you know, I'm concerned that I might be developing dementia, and, you know, it's not so bad right now, but I, you know, want to catch it as early as I can. What do you recommend? And they'll probably refer you to getting that cognitive test. And, you know, the test is not like super difficult. It's not something you have to study for. It's, you know, just tests like your ability to like think in a moment, you know, and like, what day is it today? Who's the president? It's like those types of questions. Okay. I saw like 30 bulldozers in a dirt lot going like mad. Yeah, that was the new hospital that they're building in Wuhan. Wild. Dizzy spells and loss of balance concerning. I'm not quite sure what you are referring to. Nature locks sugar up. Cane chews like bamboo. Honey has bees. Yeah, it's true. I mean, yeah, evolutionarily, of course, it totally makes sense that we would be very, very sensitive and rewarded by simple carbohydrates because they are an extraordinarily efficient source of immediate cellular energy, right? You know, our sort of metabolism is evolved to burn sugar extremely effectively and fat a little bit less effectively, but also fat, and then actually amino acids we can break down. But sugar is a great source of energy. And so if you're, you know, the sort of like survival method or strategy of humans evolving in the savannas of Africa was working together and basically outrunning animals, like running for longer than, not faster, but longer. And, you know, so having energy is you know, in the form of sugar is quite helpful. So yeah. Have you heard of those Halo headphones? You know, I have. I think I'm conflating a couple of different little I'll just come right out with it, pseudoscientific kind of devices. I don't remember if Halo is the one where there's like these like electrodes along the headband of the headphones that purport to like enhance cognition by like delivering very, very subtle stimulation. Be skeptical, you know. Okay. But yeah, I'm not 100% sure that I'm remembering accurately what Halo headphones are. Have you seen any articles on neurogenesis in psilocybin mushrooms? Yes, very interesting topic. And in fact, I'm planning next Sunday or sometime this week, depending on if my baby permits me, talking about microdosing of psilocybin and LSD. There's a bunch of interesting research that's really come out in like the past decade, mostly because for many decades it was essentially impossible to, you know, rigorously study from a basic science perspective, psilocybin, LSD, the psychedelic hallucinogens. So yes, I do recall seeing a study that indicated that there was an increase in neurogenesis, specifically in the dentate gyrus of the hippocampus, which is one of the only places in the adult brain in which neurogenesis continues. After we've gotten older than my 1-year-old daughter, actually about 3 years old. And that's interesting. It's important to note that, however, neurogenesis in and of itself is not necessarily beneficial or disadvantageous, right? It's just like, it's like when people will sometimes bring up like, how can I increase neuroplasticity? It's not it's that neuroplasticity can be bad and it can be good. It's just sort of like part of the game, part of the process of the biology of our brain, right? And so, more neurons or more new neurons being generated in the dentate gyrus, generally speaking, would be a positive thing, but in and of itself is not therapeutic. For example, there have been some studies that have shown that anxiety-associated conditions and chronic stress decreases rates of neurogenesis in that. So when I say the dentate gyrus of the hippocampus is a very large brain region, very famously associated with memory, and mostly like working memory, like short-term memory, sort of. And the dentate gyrus is sort of like a part of the hippocampus. Different parts of the hippocampus have different properties and different, signaling functions. Neurogenesis has been shown to occur in the dentate. And so I have seen studies that correlate anxiety-associated behavior with reduced rates of neurogenesis in that brain region. And I do believe those studies did make the claim that it was the rates of neurogenesis that were influencing anxiety-associated behavior and not the other way around. I don't believe that has reached a sort of consensus in the scientific community yet. So I've seen that correlation. Yes, that was a very long answer. But if you're interested in that topic, next week, unless another story like this water purity story comes out, I'm planning on covering microdosing as thoroughly as I can on my YouTube channel, which is, you can find my YouTube channel by typing in like Ian Anthropoid Brain or something like that. And earlier today, I talked about this recent story that came out that showed higher concentrations than expected of a family of chemicals in the drinking water of many cities throughout the country, including Philadelphia, and PFAS. These are chemicals that are associated with like Teflon, the production of Teflon, or like flame retardant foams that firefighters use to fight fires, but a bunch of other things like the coatings of like fast food containers and non-stick pans, obviously Teflon. And so you can check that out. It's a sort of complex story given the sort of the different entities that are making various claims and criticisms. But regardless, you can check that out. So yeah. All right. Why did the brain call itself brain? That's interesting. I actually don't know why we arrived at brain. There's a really great book actually called The Tale of the Dueling Neurosurgeons by an author named Sam Keene that goes into a lot of the history of neuroscience and the sort of like predecessors of modern neuroscience, because neuroscience as it's like practiced by people like me really hasn't existed for all that long. You might call it like modern neuroscience, and it's just the proliferation of a bunch of tools that are available to us that would strike Andreas Vesalius at the time, arguably one of the earliest neuroanatomists, as like witchcraft, like literally witchcraft. In fact, when I was in college, the notion that I would be able to use some of the tools that I'm using like right now, they strike me as sorcery. Like I can control the activities of very specific neurons in very specific parts of the brain in a waking animal and just watch what happens. Like it's so wild when you step back from it all. All right. Are there any new treatments and breakthroughs in MS research? Yes, there are. I had notes on a recent article. Okay, so in lieu of, or due to the frailties of my primate brain, I'll keep it brief. There are efforts in regenerative. So multiple sclerosis, for anybody who's not familiar, is a condition. It's a demyelinating condition. It's a condition where the immune system attacks the sort of insulation that coats the connections between neurons, or axons. Specifically, this is called myelin, right? and multiple sclerosis and its kind of sister disease, Guillain-Barré, both are a byproduct of the immune system attacking those myelin cells and degrading them, one being in the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord, and the other being in the peripheral nervous system. And so there has been progress in, there are like multiple ways to approach this problem. So first of all, it's the immune system that is attacking, right? So perhaps you could convince the immune system to stop attacking using small molecule drugs. Then, these are myelin cells, and can we potentially recuperate or accommodate the loss of those myelin cells by just generating new myelin, right? Via like regenerative medicine through the use of stem cells, for example. And there has been progress there. I do recall that there was a project, I believe at either Genentech or Eli Lilly, that they had developed a small molecule treatment for multiple sclerosis that was that had shown indications that it was superior to the current treatments. There are no cures for either multiple sclerosis or Guillain-Barré. And so, yes, but God, I was hoping that just by dancing around this topic, I'd be able to remember, but I'm failing to remember that most recent story. I'm sorry about that. Okay. There's a famous, Tracy Campbell. I feel like you're familiar for some reason. There's a famous neurocriminologist at UPenn. Have you met him or worked with him? So there are two neuroscientists at the University of Pennsylvania who have been involved in, what you might call like neuro law, right? And this emerges from the kind of recent integration of neuroscience into criminal law. So specifically, for example, using fMRI or MRIs to determine culpability, specifically or particularly at like capital crime cases or, cases where the death penalty is a potential outcome. And a lot of this emerges from, some like really interesting and tragic historical stories of, like, for example, Charles Whitman, who's, sort of like a standard example where this was a guy who was highly educated, he's an engineer, and was living an essentially normal life, no indication that there was anything aberrant about him. One day he climbed to the top of the clock tower, I believe at the University of Texas at Austin, and just randomly started shooting people with a rifle until he was taken out by police officers. It turned out they then went back to his house to sort of investigate, and it turned out that he had also killed his wife and his mother, and he left a note, essentially a suicide note, but a note where he basically articulated that he's experiencing all these uncontrollable urges towards violence. He doesn't understand them, and he hopes that once upon his inevitable demise, scientists will evaluate his brain and try and divine what was causing this violent predisposition. And so they did. And it turned out that he had a very large tumor adjacent to the amygdala. And now we don't know for sure if the presence of that tumor had any causative effect on this violent behavior, but it is an abnormal anatomical, event, right? And, so a lot of philosophy and neurophilosophy emerges from this, right? Because it's like, okay, so let's just take for granted that, the presence of that tumor caused that violent behavior. Does that make him less culpable? Right? I mean, couldn't you argue that somebody, so he had no control over that tumor. It's not like he chose to put it there, but couldn't you argue that somebody who was, abused as a child, perhaps exposed to, habit-forming drugs at a very, very young age, was bereft of any opportunity, and who then ultimately engaged in violent behavior, couldn't you argue that they were a victim of circumstance themselves, right? Are they culpable because they encountered a world that kind of facilitated and promoted the very behavior that got them, imprisoned or to cause them to commit crime? It's an interesting philosophical debate. But in any case, at the University of Pennsylvania, there are two, and they're really cognitive neuroscientists who kind of participate in neuro law. And it's kind of interesting because they vehemently disagree with one another. So one is Reuben Gur. He's a pretty well-established cognitive neuroscientist at Penn. He's been the expert witness on the majority of these cases where neuroscience has been sort of invoked on some level. And then it's Jeffrey, Come on, not Jeffrey Newell. It is Jeffrey. Oh, that's so frustrating. God. So a guy named Jeffrey, this dude I know named Jeffrey, a neuroscientist named Jeffrey. That's frustrating. Starts with a G, I think his last name. He argues, he's also a cognitive neuroscientist. I believe he also has an MD. I could be wrong about that. But he essentially wrote a brief for the Department of Justice saying that neuroscience has no place in a court of law at this juncture because judges, juries, lawyers really do not have the expertise to appropriately interpret scientific findings. You know, I would argue, as somebody who's, I do circuit neuroscience, I focus on cells and circuits of cells. I would argue that cognitive neuroscience, even a cognitive neuroscientist, isn't in a position to really competently evaluate a relationship between fMRI signals, right? Changes in metabolism throughout different parts of the brain and behavior. I just don't think that cognitive neuroscience has progressed to that point quite yet. And so the notion that a judge who probably has never taken a class in neuroscience would be in a position to do so is, I would argue, I would agree with my dude Jeffrey, that it's not a good idea. So that's my baby daughter right there, being super cutie. Yeah, you have to do some tests on myself. So I don't know if you're referring to them, but they're both pretty well-established cognitive neuroscientists, and they have this disagreement. I was hoping at some point, a few years ago, when I was still in grad school, which I was still in grad school a month ago, but I was hoping to have them do a debate, because this is a pretty fundamental disagreement about their shared discipline, and I think it'd be really. And they're also part of the same department, so they're colleagues. They probably talk to each other regularly. God, I thought I almost remembered his last name. It's so frustrating. But alas, no debate transpired. It's very interesting. Here late, but thoughts on high school football. So I played football in high school. I was a running back and a fullback at times, and also a cornerback, because that was how big our team was. I was a much better cornerback, but because we had a terrible offensive line. And because of that terrible offensive line, I got probably 2 concussions in one game. I could get into it's because my coach, I at least at the time could run pretty fast. And so, if we just did, flicks out to the side, I could at least get some yards and run, generally, because then I could run faster than the gigantic linebackers or whatever that ultimately demolished me, because my coach didn't want to only ever do that play, and he wanted me to run through the holes that did not exist. And so, I got demolished, and my parents very astutely said, that's the last time you're playing this game. And they didn't want me to play in the first place. But anyways, so, if I have my child, or if I have a child that wants to play football, I will definitely forbid it. I think it's a judgment call that every parent's gonna have to make. Part of my judgment is that I do not have the genetics of a professional football player. I'm not tall enough it would be absurd for me to try to get big enough to actually have a shot at playing professional football. Some people do, though. And it's very remunerative, right? It's very lucrative. But the reality is that, as is the case with other sports, not just the NFL, but in the United States, the NFL is the chief cause of it. Recurrent head trauma definitely can be associated with dementia later on in life, and potentially quite early in life. And so it is kind of a gamble that you're taking, or you're making, with your current lucrative income versus your future cognitive health. And I know my parents very advisedly tried to get me to not play football, and I will put my foot down even harder for my kids if they want to play football. By the way, football is not the only high school sport that's associated with recurrent head trauma. Soccer is the leading cause of subconcussive TBIs, or of brain injuries, let's say, in girls in the United States. But then also, hockey, no surprise there. Also, wrestling is associated with head trauma in high school. high schoolers are more vulnerable to concussions than adults. It just so happens that, just because of the biology and the anatomy. And of course, there's a lot of cognitive development that's occurring during adolescence, and it's just a potential risk factor that is just totally unjustifiable given what my children are likely to look like, just because of my genetics and because of my wife's genetics. So that's what I think about it. But far be it for me to try and dictate to any other parent how they should raise their kids. But I do think that it's hard to justify for probably most people who play, tackle football in high school. I know that socially that's a difficult thing to navigate because, so I lived in Texas for a while, and there are parts of Texas where the whole city goes to every high school football game, and it's a big part of the economy basically. And that's not just Texas. I just happen to have lived there. So it's a real concern. I hate the idea of integrating neuroscience into criminal law, by the way. Yeah, I mean, I think most, I haven't met many neuroscientists who argue the opposite. But, of course, there are many neuroscientists who are far senior to me who do think that it can be justified. My overall perception of how it's generally used is to demonstrate innocence, but rather than culpability. There have been some cases, I believe in India, where I think an fMRI or something was actually used to demonstrate culpability, which I think is even worse because there's just so many ways that you could get that wrong. And only one way to get it right. I know, but I agree with you. I mean, that said, I do think, as neuroscience, with a more completed neuroscience, it's probably going to be inevitable. Once cognitive neuroscience does reach a point where we have effectively bridged the gap between changes in brain activity and behavior or cognitive experiences or, emotional experiences. And as technology progresses, we'll have better and better methods of actually imaging changes in brain activity at the level of specific circuits of neurons or specific neurons. That is my least favorite of my daughter's toys. She has a bunch of really fun toys. Actually, recently, my wife got her this. So I play the guitar. You can see the background there. I primarily play the acoustic guitar for her. I've been playing actually the same song for my daughter ever since she was probably 3 weeks old. So my wife got this toy that's like a toy guitar, but it's like a toy electric rock guitar, and I think it's like the what is it, the Explorer guitar, where it's sort of like this rhombus, or I don't really know, it's a weird shape, and it has all these lights on it. It's so intense. And she played it, we like to dim the lights as it gets later so that our circadian rhythm isn't all screwed up, and she's playing, it's just whoa. Just so much activity. That's one of my favorite of her toys. All right. Hey man, I can't stay around today, but I want to say, hey, what's up, Scott? Good to talk to you, man. Or good to see you. Hope all is well. So we're getting a caller. Trying to connect here. So what's your name and where are you calling from? Are you there?
Yeah, how's it going? How are you?
Oh, Farside. Yeah, awesome. So what's on your mind?
Cool, man. Cool, man. The last time that I phoned in, I basically just told you guys a bit of revelation with regards to myself and my recovery and the pink cloud. But I didn't quite actually get as far as I wanted to go with regards to a question I wanted to ask you. But nonetheless, you were very helpful in this type of thing. So thank you very, very much.
It's my pleasure.
Right. Cool. Right. What I wanted to ask you was, in my recovery, okay, so basically I was a crack, cocaine, and heroin user, and I was for a period of 17 years, okay, mainlining heroin, smoking and cooking my own free-base crack cocaine, so of the purest quality, and snorting, of course, cocaine as well as doing heroin, as well as doing MDMA, ecstasy, LSD, all the other peripherals as well.
Wow.
Okay. All right. So basically, the only thing that I actually managed to actually clear of was barbiturates and anthrax.
which is a common problem in South Africa. I don't know about the rest of the world. Basically, Mandrax is barbiturates. I'm sure you know what barbiturate is.
Sure.
Okay, so Mandrax is the smoking of barbiturate tablets, and basically it causes, it's got its own sort of side effects and can really mess a person up with long-term use. Anyway, besides that, what I wanted to find out from you was that so what I was trying to say to you the last time, the research that I did basically told me about the pink cloud and all that type of crap and everything else, and fine. But what I did discover was that what was recommended, not necessarily scientifically proven or scientifically sort of expounded upon too much, was that for every 10 years of hardcore drug abuse that you put your body through, it takes about roughly 1 year for your brain to rewire its network or to rewire its pathways back to its original state. Okay, does that make sense to you? Do you understand what I'm saying to you?
Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. Yeah.
Okay, so basically, I was a 20-year user. So basically, 2 years is what I had to look forward to with regards to that. Okay, so fine, cool. What I wanted to find out from you is, in the time period of my recovery, so basically while I was still using narcotics and while I was still using drugs and this type of thing, my memory was as sharp as it always had been, and I didn't have any sort of lapses in reasoning, any lapses in sort of memory, anything like that. But what I did find was, unfortunately for me, I basically died. I'm not going to go too much into that. Died, was sent back, and within 10 days of that, I managed to give up on crack, cocaine, and heroin, something which had basically ruled my life for 17 years, which I'd not been able to get rid of. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Fine, cool. So done. So I phoned my parents up and I said to them, listen, folks, I know you and I haven't spoken in 6 years, and I told you to fuck off 6 years ago, but listen, do you mind if I please come home and chill on your couch and recover? And I know you've heard this before 15,000 billion times, but I'm serious this time. I want to do it, and please, will you take me back? And my parents graciously, they accept me back and they take me back. Right, great. So you quite me off. My fans are joined on because they actually want to hear the story as well. Okay, so fine, cool, great. Now, what I wanted to ask you is, in that time period that it took for me to essentially leave the city and come home to my parents' sort of place, I detoxified myself off heroin, using what's the stuff called, Suboxone. Okay, and then I did it for a period of 4 days. Then I did crack and did the cocaine over the next 6 days. Then I was done. I was clear and finished.
Mm-hmm.
In the meantime, my mother decided that she would go and consult the doctor, because this was the first time that my parents had ever actually come across me using heroin. Prior to this, I'd never really used heroin before. Okay, and so it was the first time that they were dealing with heroin. So they went to consult with our family GP, and the family GP recommended, no, that of course I must go on a course of Suboxone. Okay, so once I got home, I said to my parents, listen, I've done my detox, because I didn't actually want to let you guys see me going through my detox. I've done it, I promise you, everything's done and sorted. Here it is. Can I just chill, and can we sort of just go from there? And my mum was like, no, bullshit, you will do a Suboxone detox. And I said to her, but I've done a Suboxone detox, I don't need to do this. But of course the doctor had recommended that I do, and of course the doctor's word was law. So she decided that bugger this, no matter what I told her, she was going to put me on Suboxone. It was during this time that I was on Suboxone, and funny enough, I was on the heaviest Suboxone you could possibly get. I think 32 milligram Suboxone, which is very heavy compared to what I'd had actually used. And it was during this time that my parents were rigorously basically forcing me to take my Suboxone every day for a period of 2 weeks. I had to take it.
Yeah.
And it was at this time I sustained sort of almost like a problem with my speech, to the point that I eventually said to my parents, please, this stuff is fucking me up, excuse my language, please, I need to stop taking it because I've already done my detox. I don't need to do this again. And eventually they related and said, okay, fine. But what I did find over the course of specifically like month 4, 5, 6, and 7 was that my addiction went for a bowl of shit, that my ability to talk and string sentences together sometimes went for a bowl of shit, and specifically my ability to pronounce words without stuttering or slurring went for a bowl of shit. Now, this is after not using anything whatsoever, going through a recovery process. So what I wanted to ask you is it possible that when your brain is healing and basically rediscovering its original neural pathways back and sorting all that out, is it possible that in the process that you could actually get brain damage? Because I want to know, because I have sustained a significant amount of brain damage in this regard.
Yeah, no, I got you. Okay, so you know, as you describe, there were a bunch of drugs that were on board early on, right? So it wasn't just opioids, right? It was crack and MDMA and a bunch of other drugs, right? And once you know, the complexity of what's going on in the brain, once you have so many of these different drugs, many of which interact with the same parts of the brain, but of course also interact with other parts of the brain, it's very difficult to predict what kind of damage may occur. And you know, the damage doesn't necessarily occur at the moment that the drug is exerting its effects. And then of course, you know, there's, you know, concerns regarding purity and stuff like that. There can potentially be, you know, hazardous adulterants in certain samples of drugs, right? I'm sure you're familiar with all that.
Sure.
So when you are, if we're talking specifically about opioids, okay, so let's just put that aside for a second, even though it's very, very important. Specifically opioids. Recovery from opioids is generally speaking, assuming that, you know, there was no bloodborne pathogens that one was exposed to, like hepatitis and so on when they were injecting, assuming that there's no infection. Recovery from opioids themselves do not damage the nervous system, strangely enough. They're extremely addictive, extremely euphoric, but contrary to the effects of like methamphetamine, MDMA at high enough doses, which actually do potentially damage the nervous system, opioids don't. And however, sorry about this, but so recovery from, you know, withdrawal from opioids, detox as it's, you know, referred to, can manifest a bunch of anomalous behavior, right? Because you're all of a sudden very anxious. Of course you're experiencing the withdrawal, right? You feel bad.
May I interject very quickly just to give you some more background into this?
Okay.
Sure, right. Okay, so I was a hardcore drug user for 20 years.
Yeah.
Of those 20 years, for the first 10 years, I only basically used cocaine. And when I say I used cocaine, I was a international trafficker. So the quality of cocaine that I used
was very high.
Was very, very high. And I got to the point where after 2 years, I was using a minimum of 10 grams of uncut pure cocaine a day. Right. Then after 10 years, that then became a freebase problem.
Yeah.
Where I would cook the coke and I'd make my own freebase. So
Yeah.
the freebase that I was using was of the highest quality. The cocaine that I was using was of the highest quality. The ecstasy that I used was of the highest quality, but I only used ecstasy and MDMA basically in my early 20s, but I did use a maximum of about 60 pills a weekend. Okay, so I'm talking about like massive overdosing.
Yeah.
On like 125 milligrams of MDMA.
Okay, I got you. I mean, that's super heavy usage, right? I mean, and like I get the picture, and like, you know, psychomotor stimulants.
The heroin only came in the last 16 months of my total addiction, and because I was very wary of heroin, my maximum usage of heroin was 0.1 of a gram a day.
Okay, I mean, so I understand. I get it. That is meaningful, right? So psychomotor stimulants, as I was, you know, describing, they can be associated with neurotoxicity, and
Sure.
opioids less so. And it's tough to know the extent. I mean, that is definitely very heavy use. You know, I don't have to tell you. And cocaine is certainly associated with, deleterious effects on the brain. And so, you know, it's the kind of thing where you won't necessarily know immediately what kind of lasting ramifications might exist from that level of usage. But you know, to get back to the recovery from opioids. So like, 16 months is also a pretty long time. It's not 17 years, but so, withdrawal can result in things like stuttering or anxiety associated behavior that are not a direct byproduct of, a toxic effect of, let's say, heroin or oxycodone, but rather just a byproduct of you navigating this newly elevated level of anxiety. But then, that aside, the, heavy use of essentially any psychomotor stimulant can definitely be associated with long-lasting abnormal, mood, abnormal behavior as a byproduct of damage that has been done to those neurons that those drugs affect. But listen, I mean, I'm glad that you're getting a treatment. I understand how frustrating it might be that you feel like you're in a position where you've recovered quite a bit, but your parents or your loved ones are disagree. I get that, but what's encouraging, what I would be encouraged by is that you have people around you who are concerned with your well-being, and it's great that you're seeing a physician about it. It's the best thing you can do given the circumstances. Best of luck moving forward, man. Best of luck with your recovery.
Cool. Can I just expound on one more thing? Sorry, what I wanted to say to you is, it wasn't the immediate withdrawal from the heroin and from the crack and the cocaine and that type of thing that caused any of the shit. Okay, I'm talking about months down the line. So 6, 7, 8 months later,
I understand.
After being totally clean, all of a sudden, the one day I woke up and I started stuttering. Then the next day I woke up and I was slurring. Then basically my diction went for a ball of shit. So I have random days still to this day. And I used to be a radio show host, where I would host radio. So I've got a perfect radio voice. I used to be very bubbly. I used to be on the ball, on the money, like very, very quick and this type of thing. But what I'm saying to you is it possible that during the withdrawal, and I'm talking about the long-term withdrawal, not the immediate withdrawal, the long-term withdrawal process, that you can actually sustain brain damage by the neural pathways recreating themselves by your brain, basically? Can that happen?
I understand what you're saying. Yeah. I mean, theoretically, potentially. I can't tell you for sure. And, yes, it can take a while for, the end results of exposure to all of those drugs to manifest. It can take a while. I'm sorry to hear it. Listen, just because it has happened doesn't mean that it's going to be a permanent state of affairs. I would absolutely bring these concerns up with any physician you have, because there is some neuroimaging that can be done that then can help you to determine, okay, is there an anatomical explanation for this? Is this psychiatric? I mean, stuttering can be treated via, psychiatric intervention. I would bring this up with your physician. It's possible, but it's not inevitable. But listen, man, thanks for calling in. I really appreciate, as always, you sharing your story. Hope to talk to you again. Take it easy.
Yeah, thank you so much. You rock, brother. You rock.
That's very nice of you to say. I appreciate it. Have a good one, man. Oh, sorry. I'm pretty sure Farside is from South Africa. I love that South Africa accent. And I know it's like, I wasn't going to, we were talking about something so serious and somber, but such a cool accent. Okay. Right. Medium chain triglycerides. Explain it, please. Sure, we can talk about that. Sam Harris, another interesting scientist. Sam Harris is interesting, I agree with him on some things. I definitely disagree with him on other things. But yeah, my daughter does too. For example, I think his takes on free will are some of the clearest and most accurate I've seen. So medium chain triglycerides. They are triglycerides with medium chains. But basically what they are fats that, so if you think of what a fat is essentially a long hydrocarbon chain, right? The length of those chains can vary. depending upon, and then in those chains, you can have different types of bonds. You can have double bonds, single bonds. They can be saturated fats, unsaturated fats, and so on. So medium chain triglycerides. So a saturated fat, for example, will look solid at room temperature. So butter has saturated fat in it. Coconut oil has saturated fat in it. However, there's a difference that the components or the constituents of butter and coconut oil distinguish themselves, right? So what's distinct about medium chain triglycerides what's distinct about coconut oil is that it is enriched with medium chain triglycerides. And butter doesn't really have significant concentrations of medium chain triglycerides. Now, why does that matter? Who cares? So to break down essentially any fat or most fat, there's this long metabolic process that has to occur where this sort of metabolic component called micelles have to be produced to essentially enable us to break down a fat into useful, essentially ketone bodies or just useful biomolecules. The difference between a medium chain triglyceride and other fats is that we don't have to do that with medium chain triglycerides. We can just burn them, kind of similarly to how we can just burn glucose or carbohydrates. And so as a result, it's sort of a different metabolic pathway that MCTs or medium chain triglycerides is metabolized. There are some interesting biomedical science regarding the health benefits of a diet that's rich in MCTs. I believe avocado also has fairly high, comparatively high concentrations of MCTs, and compared to like your typical fats, there's some evidence that MCTs are associated with less of the deleterious effects to health that particularly saturated fats have been associated with. And so, yeah, but that's the principal difference, is how quickly we can metabolize MCTs. All right. Aspiring to go to med school. Mr. Steak Girl, or Mrs. Teak Girl, perhaps. Mr. Steak Girl or Mrs. Teak Girl, either one. Aspiring to go to med school. Good luck. It's super challenging and can be extremely rewarding. What's my GPA? You don't really follow your GPA once you're in at least a PhD program. I honestly don't remember. Honestly, I would tell you if it was low, but I can't. I haven't looked at it for probably 6 years, and it doesn't play a significant role in You're only focused on completing your research and finishing your PhD, which I finished last month. Does it need to be very high to get into med school? Yes. So, it depends on what med school you want to go to, but med school is the sort of process of going to med school is far more kind of simpler, or the trajectory is kind of more consistent and standardized. A lot of people go to med school or want to go to med school, and so your GPA matters a lot. Your UCLA, definitely you're going to have a high GPA. It's a great med school. But really any large research university or research hospital will have a pretty good med school, and UCLA certainly has a great one. But yeah, so even more so than PhD programs, it's sort of like law school. You have to have a great GPA. You have to have high MCAT scores in the case of med school, or LSATs in the case of law school. But then if you're in high school right now, here's what I would recommend that will help to distinguish you from the other very, very competent people that will definitely be wanting to go to UCLA. Try and get some experience. Try and do an internship in a lab, like the kind of lab I work in. Grade 10, perfect. Yeah, so if you live in LA, you're surrounded by a bunch of fabulous research institutions, and so what you can do is send an email, go online. Go find, if you are interested in certain kinds of medicine, let's say you're interested in neurology, that's just one example, cardiology, psychiatry, blah, blah, blah. Go to, UCLA. If you can do it at UCLA, that would be optimal, because then, of course, you can have people that work there advocate for you. But you can volunteer in a lab. You can do an internship, get paid to work in a lab, participate in some research. And some labs are more medically focused than others. Like some are more basic science, some are more what's called translational. And yeah, if you could get a couple years, and by the way, if you can get your name on a publication, meaning you won't be the first author as a high schooler, but if you're included in the list of authors, that will be enormously distinctive. So I worked with an undergrad. for all 4 years that he was at the University of Pennsylvania. He became very competent in the lab. And, the fact that he worked in our lab, he basically could pick whichever med school he wanted to go to. It turned out he wanted to go to the University of Pennsylvania, which is obviously a great med school. And so, having that kind of stuff on your resume will distinguish you from, there's a lot of really, really smart people. It's very, very competitive. And, getting some experience demonstrating that you're not only interested, you have a passion for this, but you've pursued that passion. That's the best advice I could give you. And plus it'll help you to get a better sense of, hey, is this really what I want to do? Certainly science is very, very different in practice than we're sort of exposed to. You're at the top of your class now. That's fabulous. Yeah. I mean, yeah. So, just do the extra mile, right? So, it will definitely help. But go the extra mile, and, get some experience in a lab, get some experience, working with a physician scientist. And, particularly if you have such stellar, grades, there will be many labs that'll be excited to take you on. And yeah, I think it's a great idea. I wish that I had known that people can even do that when I was in high school. But yeah. And, by the way, I mean, a lot of people like to say like, oh, the younger generation, they're so dumb. All they care about is their phones. I mean, they say that about my generation, right? We're facing your phones all the time. In my day, we had to walk 40 miles in the snow to, go to the grocery store, to go to the bathroom, whatever. I happen to have been able to interact with a lot of, Gen Zers or Zoomers, the generation following the millennial generation. And man, I am so impressed. I mean, of course, I'm not exposed to the whole generation, but of those that I've been exposed to, the standards are so high. Like it's very impressive. These are really, really smart kids. So the future is bright if we let them pursue their ambitions. All right. Oh, geez. What time is it? I should call it a day. Earlier on YouTube, I covered a story of elevated levels of certain compounds that are associated with the production of things like Teflon that has been measured in the waters of a bunch of different cities throughout the country, including Philly, but also Washington, D.C., some cities in North Carolina were extremely high, in New Jersey, in California. I talked about some of the issues with the study, some of the issues with the organization that conducted the study, but also some of the important issues that their study highlighted. And so you can... It's still kind of tough to find my channel over there, but Ian Brain Anthropoid or something like that, you'll probably find it. I also have a podcast. It's called Wired to be Weird. I've neglected it for a little while, but I'm planning on updating it in the not too distant future. So Wired to be Weird on iTunes and Stitcher. And finally, I know not everybody is in a position to have disposable income to chuck my way, but if you are, I would appreciate it. I have a Patreon. It's called patreon.com/anthropoid. I'm going to be updating a little bit. If you're in a position to be able to do that, I would love to be able to set up more, directed conversations on topics of your interest. If you're interested, what do we know about, dementia and exercise? I can, sort of help to explore that landscape and hopefully digest it in a more, hopefully synthesize it in a more appetizing way. So that's patreon.com/anthropoid. Yeah, patreon.com/anthropoid. Otherwise, thank you for hanging out. And at a minimum, I'll see you same place, same time next week, next Sunday. And until then, have a great week, everybody. See you guys. All right, YouTube. Thanks for watching, everybody. The few and the proud. And as I always like to say, if you have any tips for how to improve things, I am all ears, and I love the input. Yeah, otherwise, thanks for watching. Have a great week.